The late afternoon sun drenched the streets of Millbrook Heights in a golden haze, highlighting the manicured lawns and gleaming storefronts of this picture-perfect suburb. On the surface, it seemed like the kind of place where nothing truly dramatic could happen. A town defined by its quiet affluence and polite pretenses, but beneath its polished exterior, Millbrook Heights harbored the same undercurrents of bias, fear, and unspoken divides that linger in many corners of the world. Officer Frank Marshall had walked these streets for over 2 decades, his uniform a symbol of order and authority. He prided himself on his instincts, his ability to read a situation and act decisively. But instincts aren't always right. And sometimes, one decision can unravel a life built on rigid certainties. Isaiah Carter, on the other hand, was just a kid, 10 years old, bright-eyed, and full of the kind of hope that could light up the darkest of rooms. Yet even in his young life, he had learned that hope alone wasn't enough to shield him from the weight of suspicion or the sting of prejudice. This is their story, a story of confrontation and consequence, of mistakes made and bridges built. It is a journey that starts with an arrest and ends with a community learning what justice truly means. And like all good stories, it begins with a single pivotal moment. Millbrook Heights basked in the warmth of a sunlit Saturday afternoon, its tree-lined streets bustling with life. The newly opened Riverside Mall stood at the heart of the town's activity, a shining symbol of its wealth and ambition. Its glass facade reflected the sky in brilliant shades of blue and gold, while shoppers flitted in and out, their laughter mingling with the faint strains of classical music playing over the outdoor speakers. Inside his patrol car, Officer Frank Marshall watched it all with an air of practiced detachment. 23 years on the force had taught him to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him that trouble often hid in plain sight. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, scanning the crowd for anything or anyone that seemed out of place. His gaze landed on a young boy, walking purposefully toward the mall's entrance. The child was black, perhaps 10 years old, with a backpack slung over one shoulder. There was nothing overtly suspicious about him, yet Frank's gut whispered otherwise. His job, as he saw it, was to act before trouble had a chance to begin. Stepping out of his cruiser, Frank adjusted his belt and strode toward the boy, intercepting him just as he reached the glass doors. "Hold up there, son," Frank called out. The boy stopped, his expression shifting from surprise to quiet wariness. "Yes, sir," he replied, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. "Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" Frank asked, positioning himself between the boy and the entrance. "I'm meeting my friends at the food court," the boy said, maintaining eye contact. "Is there a problem, officer?" Frank gestured to the backpack. "That's quite a large bag for just meeting friends. Mind showing me what's inside?" A small crowd of shoppers began to gather, their curiosity piqued by the exchange. Isaiah Carter, though Frank did not yet know his name, hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. "I don't mean any disrespect, sir," Isaiah said, his voice calm but firm. "But I don't think I've done anything wrong. You don't have probable cause to search my bag." The officer's face reddened as whispers rippled through the growing crowd. Isaiah's composure, his refusal to cower, only seemed to heighten Frank's frustration. "Listen, son," Frank began. "I'm not your son," Isaiah interrupted quietly. "My name is Isaiah Carter, and you're stopping me because I'm black, aren't you?" The accusation hung heavy in the air, silencing the murmurs of onlookers. Frank's hand rested on his belt, and the boy's fingers tightened around the strap of his backpack. "You're causing a disturbance," Frank said, his voice rising. "I was walking into a public place. Isaiah shot back. You're the one causing a disturbance. By now, more people had their phones out, recording the scene. Isaiah, standing tall, despite the humiliation, glanced at one of the security guards who had approached. My father always told me to stay calm, he said, meeting Frank's eyes directly. Because the truth always comes out in the end. Should I call him, or will you? Frank hesitated. There was something about the boy's tone, a quiet authority that unnerved him. Your father? He asked, his voice faltering. Yes, Isaiah replied. Commissioner Marcus Carter. You might have heard of him. The name hit Frank like a punch to the gut. He'd read the memos, seen the announcements. Marcus Carter, a man with a sterling reputation for fairness and reform, had been appointed as the town's new police commissioner just weeks earlier. And now, his son stood before Frank, handcuffed by suspicion alone. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as the weight of the moment pressed down on Frank. His pride kept him from backing down, even as the cracks in his confidence began to show. Far away in the quiet of his office, Marcus Carter's phone rang, a call that would set the wheels of accountability and redemption in motion. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed faintly, casting a harsh glow over the gray walls and scuffed linoleum floors. Officer Frank Marshall sat at his desk, typing the incident report with rigid precision, each keystroke a reminder of the storm he had unwittingly unleashed. The events at the mall played on a loop in his mind. The boy's calm defiance, the crowd's growing disapproval, the weight of that name, Marcus Carter. He knew the commissioner would come. It wasn't a question of if, but when. And when Marcus Carter arrived, it would not be as a distant bureaucrat. It would be as a father. It was less than an hour later when the station doors slammed open, its metallic clang reverberating through the room. Conversations halted as Marcus Carter stepped inside, his imposing frame and sharp suit commanding immediate attention. His expression was a masterclass in controlled fury. Calm, collected, but with a simmering intensity that could silence even the boldest of voices. Where is he? Marcus asked, his voice low, but carrying across the room with the authority of a man accustomed to leading. Sergeant Wilson, who had been bracing for this moment since the phone call, gestured toward Frank's desk. Right over there, Commissioner Carter. Frank rose to his feet, his usual confidence replaced by a palpable unease. He extended a hand, only to let it drop when Marcus ignored the gesture entirely. Officer Marshall, Marcus said, his tone clipped. I need to speak with you. Now. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as Frank led Marcus into a nearby office, shutting the door behind them. For a moment, silence hung heavy in the air. Then, Marcus spoke, his voice measured but unyielding. Explain to me why my 10-year-old son was detained in handcuffs at a public mall, Marcus said, folding his arms across his chest. His gaze bore into Frank, who suddenly found the small office stifling. Frank cleared his throat, fumbling for words. Commissioner, I was following protocol. The boy, your son, was acting suspiciously. I believed it was necessary to investigate. Suspiciously, Marcus repeated, his voice rising slightly. Walking into a mall with a backpack is suspicious now? Or is it only suspicious when the boy carrying the backpack is black? Frank's jaw tightened. Sir, with all due respect, I acted based on my training. My intention was to prevent your intention, Marcus interrupted, his voice like steel, was rooted in bias. You didn't see a child. You saw a threat. And instead of questioning your instincts, you acted on them, humiliating a boy who has done nothing but try to exist in a world that already views him as less. Frank's shoulders sagged. the weight of Marcus's words pressing down on him. "I didn't mean to cause harm," he muttered, though the excuse sounded hollow even to him. Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Intentions mean nothing without accountability, Officer Marshall. My son deserves better. This community deserves better. And I will not tolerate prejudice in the department I lead." As the confrontation unfolded behind closed doors, the fallout outside the station was already gaining momentum. Videos of the mall incident had spread like wildfire, igniting a firestorm of outrage on social media. Hashtags like #Justice for Isaiah and #End Racial Profiling trended nationwide, with commentators dissecting every second of the footage. Local news stations aired the video repeatedly, amplifying the calls for justice. Protesters gathered outside the police station that evening, their chants echoing through the quiet streets of Millbrook Heights. Signs bearing messages like "Accountability Now" and "Black Lives Matter" waved in the air, their bold letters illuminated by the glow of camera flashes. Inside, the department was in chaos. Officers whispered anxiously among themselves, their eyes darting toward the commissioner's office. The pressure was mounting, and everyone knew that the department's reputation, and perhaps its future, was on the line. By the next morning, Marcus had made his decision. Frank stood at attention in the commissioner's office, his expression a mix of defiance and apprehension. "You're being reassigned," Marcus announced, handing Frank a folder. 6 weeks of community service at the Riverside Youth Center. Frank blinked, caught off guard. "Community service?" Marcus's gaze was unyielding. "Under my direct supervision. You will work with the kids you've spent your career profiling. You will listen to their stories, learn their struggles, and earn their trust. This is not a punishment, Officer Marshall. It's an opportunity. But make no mistake, if you fail to prove that you can change, you will no longer have a place on this force." Frank clenched his jaw, his pride stinging at the reprimand. But beneath his frustration was a gnawing sense of unease. He had spent years enforcing rules, not questioning them. Now, for the first time, he would have to confront the biases he had long ignored. "And one more thing," Marcus added, his tone softening slightly. "You will apologize to my son. Not as an officer to a civilian, but as a man to a boy you wronged." Frank nodded stiffly, the enormity of his task settling over him like a heavy weight. Later that day, Frank found himself standing outside the youth center, his uniform replaced with plain clothes. The vibrant murals on the building's exterior seemed almost mocking in their cheerfulness, a stark contrast to the apprehension swirling in his chest. Inside, the air buzzed with energy. Kids of all ages filled the space, their laughter and chatter creating a lively symphony of sound. Isaiah Carter stood near the basketball court, his head held high, as he explained the rules of the game to a group of younger children. Frank hesitated, his gaze fixed on the boy he had wronged. Taking a deep breath, he approached. "Isaiah," Frank said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. The boy turned, his expression unreadable. "Officer Marshall, I wanted to say," Frank faltered, the words sticking in his throat. "I'm sorry. For what happened at the mall. I was wrong, and Yeah," Isaiah interrupted, his tone cool. "You were." Frank nodded, swallowing his pride. "I'm here to make things right. If you'll let me." Isaiah studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "We'll see." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. The Riverside Youth Center sat at the edge of Millbrook Heights, a stark contrast to the affluent neighborhoods nearby. Its weathered facade and faded murals hinted at years of service to a community often overlooked. Yet, inside, it was a place alive with hope, a sanctuary for the local kids who sought refuge from the challenges of their daily lives. For Frank Marshall, it felt more like a battlefield. Frank stepped into the youth center on Monday morning, his usual confidence replaced by unease. The hum of activity was overwhelming. Kids playing basketball in the gym, younger ones coloring at a table, and teens huddled in corners whispering and laughing. The noise hit him like a wave, jarring and chaotic compared to the order of the precinct. Marcus Carter greeted him near the entrance, clipboard in hand. Dressed casually, the commissioner looked more approachable than Frank was used to seeing him. But the sharpness in his eyes reminded Frank that this wasn't a friendly visit. "Welcome to the Riverside Youth Center, Officer Marshall," Marcus said, handing him the clipboard. "Here's the schedule for the day. You'll be shadowing Ms. Rodriguez, our program coordinator. She'll show you the ropes." Frank glanced at the clipboard, already feeling out of his depth. "What exactly am I supposed to do here, Commissioner?" "You're here to listen, observe, and help," Marcus replied. "These kids need role models, not enforcers. Try to remember that." Before Frank could respond, Marcus turned and walked toward a group of parents gathered by the entrance, leaving Frank alone. Mrs. Rosa Rodriguez was a whirlwind of energy. Petite but commanding, with dark curly hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun. She had the kind of presence that made people sit up and pay attention. "Officer Marshall, right?" she said, extending a hand as she approached. "I'm Rosa. I run the after-school programs here." Frank shook her hand, noting the firm grip. "Call me Frank." "Well, Frank," she said with a tight smile, "you're going to be helping with the art workshop this morning. And before you ask, yes, you're expected to participate." Frank opened his mouth to protest, but quickly closed it. He followed Rosa to the art rooms, where a group of kids was already hard at work. Paintbrushes moved across canvases, and the air was filled with the scent of acrylic paint and laughter. One boy looked up as Frank entered, his eyes narrowing. It was Isaiah. Isaiah stood at the back of the room, arms crossed as he watched Frank with open skepticism. The other kids, however, were more curious. "Who's that?" a little girl asked, tugging on Rosa's sleeve. "This is Mr. Marshall," Rosa said, her tone light but firm. "He's here to help out and learn about what we do." "Are you a cop?" another boy asked, his eyes wide. Frank hesitated. "I am." The room fell quiet, the kids exchanging wary glances. Frank felt their unease like a physical weight. "Well, cops aren't great at painting," Isaiah said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Let's see if you're any good at that." A few kids giggled, and Rosa shot Isaiah a warning look, but Frank raised a hand, stopping her. "It's fine," he said, picking up a brush. "I'm not great at painting, but I'll give it a shot." Frank sat down at an empty spot and began to paint. His strokes were clumsy, and the colors didn't blend the way he intended, but the effort wasn't lost on the kids. Slowly, the room began to fill with chatter again. After the art session, Frank joined Rosa in the gym, where a group of teens was playing basketball. Isaiah was among them, his movements fluid and confident, as he dribbled the ball and passed it to his teammates. Frank watched from the sidelines, arms crossed. He couldn't help but notice how Isaiah seemed to command the court, his voice clear and assertive as he called out plays. The other kids listened to him, trusting his judgment without question. "You've got a leader in the making there," Frank said to Rosa, nodding toward Isaiah. Rosa smiled. "He's got a good head on his shoulders. A lot of these kids do. They just need someone to believe in them." Before Frank could respond, the game ended and the teens gathered around a bench. One boy, Tyler, leaned in close to Isaiah, speaking animatedly with his hands. To Frank, The gestures looked suspicious, too deliberate, too secretive. "I'll be right back," Frank said to Rosa, striding toward the group. The teens looked up as he approached, their expressions guarded. "What's going on here?" Frank asked, his tone sterner than he intended. "Just talking," Isaiah said, his voice calm but edged with irritation. "Why?" Frank folded his arms. Seemed like something more. Isaiah's eyes narrowed. "Because we're black kids talking on a bench? That's suspicious to you?" The air grew tense. Tyler bristled, but Isaiah placed a hand on his arm, keeping him seated. "We're discussing our basketball strategy," Isaiah said evenly. "You know, for the Youth League Championship. But I guess that looks like gang activity to you, huh?" Frank opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He knew he had overstepped, but his instincts, the same instincts he had relied on for decades, had led him here. Isaiah stood, his voice rising just enough to draw the attention of nearby kids. "You're supposed to be here to learn, Officer Marshall. Maybe start by not assuming the worst about us." Frank's face burned as Isaiah walked away, leaving him standing awkwardly in the middle of the gym. Later that day, Frank sat alone in the break room, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The confrontation with Isaiah replayed in his mind, each word cutting deeper than the last. Marcus entered, his expression unreadable as he sat across from Frank. "Rough first day?" Frank exhaled heavily. "These kids, they're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Marcus asked, leaning back in his chair. Frank hesitated, struggling to articulate his thoughts. "I don't know. Trouble, maybe. But they're smart, resourceful. And Isaiah, he's got this presence. People listen to him." Marcus nodded, his gaze steady. "He's had to grow up faster than most kids his age. The world doesn't give him the luxury of being anything less than exceptional." Frank stared into his coffee. "I messed up today. Assumed the worst about him. About all of them." "You're going to mess up," Marcus said. "That's part of unlearning. But the question is, what are you going to do about it?" Frank didn't have an answer. Not yet. The tension from Frank's first day at the youth center lingered like an unspoken challenge. Every corner of the center seemed to carry Isaiah's influence. From the murals he'd helped design to the games he organized with younger kids. Isaiah Carter wasn't just a participant, he was the heartbeat of this community. And Frank was beginning to realize it. But realizing was one thing, earning respect was another. By mid-morning, the youth center was buzzing with activity. Isaiah stood at the front of the gyms, clipboard in hand, outlining the day's schedule for the basketball team. The players, ranging from middle schoolers to teens just shy of high school graduation, hung on his every word. "All right," Isaiah said, his voice steady and commanding. "We've got the Youth League finals coming up, and I need everyone focused. Tyler, you're our point guard, but we need better communication out there. Call the plays louder, okay?" Tyler nodded, looking both motivated and slightly chastised. Isaiah's ability to lead without condescension was striking. Even Frank, watching from a distance, found himself impressed. Nearby, Rosa nudged Frank with a knowing smile. "He's something else, isn't he?" Frank nodded reluctantly. "He's got a gift, that's for sure. Leadership like that doesn't come easy, especially at his age." "He's had to step up," Rosa said. "A lot of these kids come from tough situations. Isaiah's been their anchor. He's the reason some of them keep showing up." Frank absorbed this, his respect for Isaiah growing even as he struggled with the boy's unyielding defiance toward him. He wasn't used to being challenged, let alone by a 10-year-old. Later that afternoon, Frank was assigned to oversee the after-school discussion group. He sat in the back of the room as Isaiah facilitated, his confidence and charisma shining through every interaction. Today's topic: what makes a good leader? Isaiah kicked off the conversation. A leader isn't just someone who tells people what to do. They set an example. They show respect. If they want to get respect, right? The kids nodded in agreement. A girl named Mia chimed in. Yeah, like how you always help out with stuff, even when it's not your responsibility. Isaiah shrugged, a modest smile playing on his lips. It's not about me. It's about all of us, making this place better. Frank couldn't help but admire the way Isaiah encouraged the others, drawing out even the quieter kids. But as the session wound down, Frank noticed a group of older teens huddled by the lockers. Their animated conversation caught his attention. Years of policing kicked in. The boys' rapid hand gestures and hushed tones set off alarms in Frank's mind. Before he knew it, he was on his feet, walking toward them. What's going on here? He asked, his voice tinged with authority. The teens froze, their laughter and conversation silenced. Isaiah, standing nearby, noticed immediately and stepped in. They're talking about the game, Isaiah said, his tone calm but laced with irritation. You know, basketball? Frank's gaze shifted from Isaiah to the teens. Seemed like something else. Because they're black kids talking in a group, Isaiah challenged, crossing his arms. That's why you came over, isn't it? The room fell silent, all eyes on Frank. The teens looked at him with a mix of fear and anger, while Isaiah's expression was a steely mask of defiance. Frank opened his mouth to defend himself but stopped. He realized the damage was already done. The incident cast a shadow over the rest of the day. The teens avoided Frank, their laughter and energy dampened. Isaiah was quieter too, his usual leadership tinged with frustration. Frank found himself at the front desk, filling out attendance logs, when Rosa approached. A rough day? She asked, her tone softer than usual. Frank sighed, setting down his pen. I keep screwing up. I see something, and my instincts take over. It's automatic. Rosa nodded. Those instincts were trained over decades, Frank. But they're not always right. Frank looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. So, how do I fix it? You start by listening, Rosa said, and by understanding that these kids are more than what you assume about them. Her words stayed with Frank long after the center had emptied for the day. The next morning, Frank arrived early, determined to approach the day differently. He watched Isaiah from a distance, marveling at the way he seemed to embody the values Frank had spent his career enforcing, but not always practicing. Respect, accountability, and integrity. During an art session, Frank decided to take a step back, letting the kids lead. When a boy struggled with his painting, Frank resisted the urge to offer advice, and instead asked, "What do you think would work best?" The boy thought for a moment before replying, "Maybe more blue." "Let's try it," Frank said, handing him the paintbrush. It was a small moment, but it felt like progress. In the afternoon, another test of Frank's growth came when a heated debate broke out in the gym. Tyler and another boy, Jamal, were arguing over a missed play during practice. Voices escalated, and the other kids began to gather. Frank moved toward them, his instincts screaming for him to take control. But before he could intervene, Isaiah stepped between the two boys. "Hey!" Isaiah shouted, his voice cutting through the noise. "What's this about?" "He's not listening to the plays," Jamal said, pointing at Tyler. "Because your calls don't make sense," Tyler shot back. Isaiah held up his hands. "Okay, enough. Jamal, next time, explain the play better. Tyler, trust your teammate. We're on the same side, remember?" The boys nodded reluctantly, tension easing, as Isaiah clapped them both on the shoulders. Now get back out there. We've got a championship to win. Frank stood frozen, amazed. He realized Isaiah had handled the situation far better than he would have. That evening, as Frank walked to his car, he found Isaiah waiting for him by the parking lot. "Hey," Isaiah said, his tone less confrontational than usual. "About yesterday." Frank tensed, expecting another reprimand. "I get it," Isaiah continued. "You see stuff and react. But you've got to understand, we're not the bad guys here." Frank nodded, his voice quiet. "I know. I'm trying to unlearn it. But it's harder than I thought." Isaiah studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "At least you're trying." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. As Frank drove home, he replayed the day's events in his mind. Isaiah's leadership, his willingness to stand up for his peers, and even his small olive branch of understanding. It all added up to something Frank couldn't ignore. Isaiah Carter wasn't just a kid. He was a reminder of everything Frank needed to learn, unlearn, and become. And for the first time, Frank felt a flicker of hope that he might be up to the challenge. The youth center had become a second home for Frank Marshall in ways he hadn't anticipated. Each day brought new challenges, not the kind he faced as a cop, but quieter, subtler ones that chipped away at his preconceptions. Yet for every small victory, there were reminders of how much further he had to go. Today would be one of those days. The Riverside Mall was bathed in soft golden light as the late afternoon sun filtered through its towering glass facade. The fundraiser was the talk of Millbrook Heights, drawing affluent donors, city officials, and business leaders. It was a crucial event to secure funding for the youth center, and Marcus Carter, as the police commissioner, had been invited to give a keynote speech. Frank arrived wearing his dress blues, the polished badge on his chest gleaming under the overhead lights. He felt out of place among the tailored suits and cocktail dresses, but Marcus had insisted he attend. "You've been working closely with the center," Marcus had said. "Your presence will show the community that you're invested in making amends." But the weight of that investment felt heavier with each passing moment. Frank scanned the room, his eyes catching on the familiar faces of Isaiah and his father. Isaiah was busy helping distribute programs, his usual confidence intact, while Marcus mingled effortlessly with the donors. Frank stayed on the fringes, unsure where he fit in this polished crowd. Frank's aimless wandering brought him within earshot of two well-dressed men standing near the hors d'oeuvres table. Their conversation, though hushed, carried an unmistakable edge. "These youth center programs," one man said, adjusting his silver cufflinks, "they're all well and good. But you have to wonder about the kind of kids they attract." "Exactly," the other replied. "It's a slippery slope. Start letting them feel too comfortable, and who knows what kind of trouble they'll bring into places like this." Frank felt his stomach twist. He knew who they meant by them. The words hung in the air like smoke, choking the sense of progress he'd been clinging to. He clenched his fists, his pulse quickening. Confronting civilians wasn't his jurisdiction, or so he told himself. But the thought of staying silent gnawed at him. He glanced across the room and saw Isaiah watching, his expression unreadable. It was as if the boy could see right through him, daring him to act. Frank turned back to the men. "Excuse me," he said, his voice cutting through their quiet disdain. They looked at him surprised. "Those kids you're talking about, they're the reason this event is happening. They're the future of this community, and they deserve to be treated with respect." The men exchanged glances, their expressions quickly morphing into polite neutrality. "Of course," one said, though the edge in his tone suggested otherwise. They moved away, leaving Frank standing alone, his heart pounding. From across the room, Isaiah gave a slight nod, his approval subtle but unmistakable. Later that evening, Frank found Isaiah sitting near the fountain in the mall's atrium, away from the noise of the fundraiser. The boy was twirling an empty glass in his hands, his face unreadable. "You handled that well," Isaiah said, without looking up as Frank approached. Frank took a seat beside him, his uniform stiff and uncomfortable against the sleek marble bench. "You saw that?" "Hard not to," Isaiah replied. "I was watching to see if you'd actually do something." Frank exhaled, his shoulders slumping. "I almost didn't." "But you did," Isaiah said, his tone less confrontational than usual. "That's a start." Frank studied the boy, marveling at how someone so young could carry himself with such maturity. "You make it sound easy," he said, "standing up like that." "It's not," Isaiah admitted, "but it's necessary. If I let stuff like that slide, it just keeps happening. You get that now, don't you?" Frank nodded. "I'm trying to." The fundraiser continued into the evening, culminating in Marcus Carter's keynote address. The commissioner stood at the podium, commanding the room with his natural charisma. "We are here tonight, not just to support the youth center," Marcus began, his voice steady and resolute, "but to support a vision of a community where every child, regardless of background, feels valued and empowered." Frank found himself hanging on every word, the speech striking a chord he hadn't expected. Marcus spoke of accountability, of the need for institutions to reflect the communities they served. It was a call to action, one that resonated deeply with Frank's growing understanding of his role, not just as an officer, but as a member of this community. When the speech ended, the room erupted in applause. Frank clapped too, though his mind was elsewhere. He thought of his own words earlier that evening, and of how far he still had to go to live up to the ideals Marcus had laid out. As the fundraiser wound down, Marcus approached Frank. "Good job tonight," he said, his tone approving. "I heard about your conversation with the donors." Frank shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It was the right thing to do." "That's the point," Marcus said. "Doing the right thing isn't about comfort. It's about courage." Frank glanced over at Isaiah, who was helping clean up the last of the tables. "He's got plenty of that," Frank said. Marcus followed his gaze, a small smile playing at his lips. "He does. But so do you, Frank. You just have to keep using it." The next day at the youth center, the kids were buzzing about the fundraiser. Many of them had seen clips of Marcus's speech on social media, their pride evident in the way they talked about the commissioner. Frank, however, remained a quiet presence, his thoughts still lingering on the previous night's events. During a break in activities, Isaiah approached him. "You meant what you said, right? About us being the future?" "Every word," Frank replied. Isaiah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Because we're watching, all of us, to see if you mean it." The challenge in Isaiah's words was clear, but so was the hope. It was a reminder that Frank's journey wasn't just about redemption for himself. It was about proving to these kids that change was possible. That night, as Frank sat alone in his small apartment, he replayed the evening's events in his mind. The confrontation, the speech, the conversations, they all felt like pieces of a puzzle he was just beginning to understand. He reached for his phone, scrolling through the Notes app, where he'd started jotting down thoughts about his experiences at the youth center. One phrase stood out, written hastily during a moment of clarity. "Growth isn't linear, but it's always worth the effort." Frank stared at the words for a long time, then closed the app. He had work to do, and he was ready to keep trying. The winds of early fall swept through Millbrook Heights, tugging at the last remnants of summer's warmth. The leaves along the streets were just beginning to turn, casting shades of amber and crimson across the sidewalks. At the youth center, the transition into a new season mirrored the slow, uneven progress in Frank Marshall's life. Growth was happening, but not without its share of challenges. Frank stood in the center's parking lot, unloading boxes of donated supplies for an upcoming arts program. His sleeves were rolled up, and his forehead glistened with sweat as he carefully stacked the materials on a dolly. From across the lot, he spotted Mr. Wilson, one of the neighborhood's most vocal elders, watching him with a critical eye. "Morning, Mr. Wilson," Frank called out, trying to sound upbeat. He pushed the dolly toward the building, hoping to bridge the invisible chasm that always seemed to exist between them. Mr. Wilson didn't return the greeting. Instead, he crossed his arms and said, "You two think a few boxes of paint and brushes are going to make us forget?" Frank froze for a moment, the weight of the dolly heavier than before. "It's not about making anyone forget," he replied evenly. "It's about doing the work, showing I've changed." Mr. Wilson stepped closer, his weathered face hard with skepticism. "Talk's cheap, Marshall. We've seen your kind before. You make promises, put on a show. But when it really counts," he shook his head. "We remember." Frank didn't argue. He'd learned enough by now to know words wouldn't sway someone like Mr. Wilson. Only time and action would. "I get it," Frank said quietly, "but I'm still going to show up." Later that day, Marcus found Frank in the center's gym, fixing a broken basketball hoop. The commissioner stood in the doorway for a moment, watching as Frank methodically tightened bolts and adjusted the net. "Wilson giving you a hard time again?" Marcus asked, stepping inside. Frank chuckled bitterly. "You could say that. Can't blame him, though." Marcus crossed his arms, leaning against the wall. "What did he say?" "That I'm all talk, that people like me don't stick around when things get tough." Frank paused, tightening another bolt. "And he's not wrong. For a long time, I was exactly that guy." Marcus's expression softened. "You've come a long way, Frank. But you're not going to change everyone's mind overnight." Frank set down his wrench, his shoulders sagging. "It's not just Wilson. It's me. Sometimes I wonder if I'm just playing a part, doing what's expected of me. What if I haven't really changed?" Marcus moved closer, his voice firm, but not unkind. "Change isn't about feeling different, Frank. It's about acting different. And from what I've seen, you're doing that." Frank nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "I hope so." That evening, Frank joined a group of kids at one of the art program tables. They were designing posters for a community cleanup day, their laughter and chatter filling the room. Isaiah sat at the far end of the table, his head bent over a sheet of poster board. Frank hesitated, then pulled up a chair beside him. "What are you working on?" Isaiah glanced up briefly. "Just a design for the cleanup. Nothing fancy." Frank leaned over to look at the drawing, an intricate blend of bold colors and sharp lines that captured the vibrancy of the neighborhood. "That's impressive," he said sincerely. "You've got talent." Isaiah didn't respond immediately, but his expression softened slightly. "Thanks." They worked in silence for a while, the gap between them feeling less like a chasm and more like a bridge under construction. Frank watched as Isaiah guided the younger kids, helping them choose colors and refine their designs. The boy's natural leadership was undeniable. "You're good at this," Frank said after a while. Isaiah shrugged. "Somebody has to be." The next day, Frank found himself in another awkward situation. While helping organize supplies in the youth center's storage room, he overheard a heated discussion among a group of teenagers in the hallway. Their voices were raised, their gestures animated, and Frank's instincts kicked in. Stepping out of the room, he said sharply, "Break it up. Now." The teens froze, their expressions a mix of confusion and frustration. One of them, Tyler, a close friend of Isaiah's, stepped forward. "We weren't fighting," he said, his tone defensive. "We were planning a basketball tournament." Frank looked at the group, realizing his mistake too late. The tension in their faces spoke volumes, and he felt the weight of his misjudgment settling in his chest. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quieter now. "I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions." The teens exchanged glances, clearly skeptical. But Tyler finally said, "Just don't do it again." As they walked away, Frank turned to see Isaiah watching from a distance. The boy's expression was hard to read, but Frank knew he'd lost ground. That night, Frank sat on his small balcony, staring out at the quiet street below. He thought about his interactions with the kids, with Mr. Wilson, with Marcus. Every step forward seemed to come with a stumble back, and the weight of his past felt heavier than ever. He reached for his notebook, flipping to a blank page. In bold letters he wrote, "What does change look like?" The answer wasn't clear yet, but Frank was determined to find it. The week ended on a high note. The community cleanup day was a success, with dozens of residents, young and old, coming together to beautify the neighborhood. Frank worked alongside the kids, picking up litter and painting fences, his interactions more natural than they'd been in weeks. Isaiah, as always, took charge, directing teams and ensuring everything ran smoothly. Frank watched him with quiet admiration, marveling at how much the boy had accomplished in such a short time. As the day wound down, Isaiah approached Frank, a faint smile on his lips. "You didn't mess up today," he said lightly. Frank chuckled. "High praise coming from you." "Don't get used to it," Isaiah replied. But there was no malice in his tone. For the first time, Frank felt like he'd earned the boy's respect, however tentative it might be. Back at home, Frank added another note to his journal. "Progress isn't about perfection. It's about persistence." He set the notebook aside and leaned back in his chair, feeling a small, unfamiliar spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. The chill of autumn had deepened, and the Riverside Mall's glass facade reflected the golden hues of the season. Inside, the bustle of shoppers created a hum of activity, a sharp contrast to the events that had taken place months ago. For Frank Marshall, the sight of the mall stirred memories he would rather forget. Yet today wasn't about the past. It was about moving forward. Isaiah Carter stood in the youth center's activity room, surrounded by a group of kids and staff. His voice was steady, filled with determination. "We need to change the way people see us. This isn't just about the youth center. It's about the whole community." He held up a blueprint of his vision, a VIP shopping day at the mall for the kids of the youth center. "We're going to show them that we belong, that we're just as deserving as anyone else." The room erupted in applause, though some exchanged skeptical glances. Could they really pull off such an ambitious event at the very place where Isaiah had been wrongfully detained? Frank, standing at the back of the room, felt a mix of admiration and apprehension. Isaiah's leadership was undeniable, but the boy's trust in him was still fragile. When Marcus Carter suggested that Frank help with the event's logistics, Isaiah's response had been less than enthusiastic. Now, as the boy laid out the details, Frank knew he had to prove himself again. The following day, Frank met with Isaiah at the youth center to discuss the event. The air between them was tense but civil. "We'll need buy-in from the mall management and store owners," Isaiah began. barely glancing at Frank. "And security needs to be tight. No slip-ups." Frank nodded, jotting down notes. "I've got connections with the mall's head of security. I can set up a meeting." Isaiah paused, considering. "Fine. But this is my project. You're just assisting." "Understood," Frank replied, his tone respectful. He knew better than to push. The next few weeks were a flurry of planning. Frank secured permissions from the mall's management and coordinated with store owners to provide discounts and gift cards for the kids. Isaiah handled the creative side, designing invitations and planning activities for the day. Though their interactions were still guarded, a rhythm began to develop, a tentative partnership. The morning of the event dawned crisp and clear. A fleet of buses arrived at the youth center to transport the kids to the mall. Isaiah stood at the center of the activity, clipboard in hand, directing volunteers and ensuring everything was in place. Frank observed from a distance, his uniform swapped for casual attire. He didn't want to intimidate the kids or draw unnecessary attention to himself. He was here to support, not to lead. As the buses pulled into the mall's parking lot, the excitement was palpable. The kids filed out, their faces alight with anticipation. Inside, the stores were ready. Balloons, banners, and smiling staff greeted them at every turn. The day went smoothly until they reached Bellamy, the mall's most exclusive boutique. The store manager, a tall man in an impeccable suit, stepped forward, his expression tight. "I'm sorry," he began, addressing Frank. "We have a strict policy about group tours. Perhaps another store would be more appropriate." Frank felt a familiar tension rise in his chest, but this time, he knew what to do. "These kids are VIP guests today, Mr. Reynolds," he said evenly. "They've been invited by mall management, and they're here to enjoy the same privileges as any other customer." The manager hesitated, his gaze darting to the group of kids, some wide-eyed with excitement, others visibly uneasy. Isaiah stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "If there's a problem, we can call the mall manager. I'm sure they'd be interested to hear why Bellamy isn't participating." The manager's face flushed. "That won't be necessary," he muttered, stepping aside. "Welcome to Bellamy." Isaiah turned to Frank, a flicker of approval in his eyes. "Not bad," he said quietly. As the day unfolded, the barriers between Frank and the kids began to crumble. He helped a young girl choose a pair of sneakers at a sports store, his advice surprisingly gentle. At the food court, he laughed along with a group of boys as they debated the merits of pizza versus burgers. And during a private movie screening organized as a surprise, he found himself sitting next to Isaiah, who seemed less guarded than before. "You've been good today," Isaiah admitted, his tone grudging but sincere. Frank smiled. "Coming from you, I'll take that as a win." The day's climax came during the closing ceremony in the mall's atrium. Isaiah took the stage, addressing the crowd of kids, volunteers, and mall patrons who had gathered to watch. "Today isn't just about shopping," he said, his voice steady and confident. "It's about showing that we all belong, that our worth isn't defined by where we come from or what people assume about us." The audience erupted in applause, but Isaiah wasn't finished. He glanced toward Frank, his expression unreadable. "And it's also about growth, about learning to see people for who they are, not who we think they are." Frank felt the weight of those words, knowing they were as much for him as they were for the audience. As the event wound down, Frank found himself standing beside Marcus in the atrium, watching the kids file out with bags of goodies and smiles on their faces. "You did good today," Marcus said, his tone approving. Frank shook his head. "Isaiah did good. I just followed his lead." Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. That's part of learning, Frank. Knowing when to lead and when to step back. Nearby, Isaiah was surrounded by a group of kids, his laughter carrying across the space. Frank caught his eye, and the boy nodded. A simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. Later that night, Frank sat in his apartment, replaying the day's events in his mind. He opened his journal and wrote, "Redemption isn't a destination, it's a journey, one small step at a time." For the first time in months, he felt like he was truly moving forward. The crisp autumn air carried a sense of urgency as sunlight filtered through the golden trees lining Main Street. Isaiah Carter stood at the edge of the youth center parking lot, his clipboard clutched tightly in his hands. Around him, groups of teenagers held poster boards painted with bold slogans like "Justice for All" and "End Racial Profiling Now." This wasn't just another Saturday for Isaiah. It was the day he would lead his first protest, a peaceful demonstration meant to shine a light on the systemic injustices that had shaped his own experiences and those of countless others. Isaiah glanced over at his best friend, Tyler Evans, who was taping another sign to a wooden stick. Tyler had been Isaiah's biggest supporter from the moment he pitched the idea for the protest. Now, as they stood among nearly 50 other youth center kids and community members, the gravity of what they were about to do settled over them. "Are you nervous?" Tyler asked, his voice low enough that only Isaiah could hear. "A little," Isaiah admitted. He looked over the growing crowd. "But it's important. People need to see us, hear us. If we don't stand up now, who will?" Tyler grinned, trying to lighten the mood. "Man, you sound like your dad." Isaiah smirked, but didn't reply. He couldn't shake the weight of expectation, both from the community and from within himself. Across the street, Officer Frank Marshall sat in his patrol car, watching the gathering crowd. His chest tightened with apprehension. Marcus Carter had informed him of the protest earlier in the week, assigning him to oversee security for the event. Frank had agreed without hesitation. But now, seeing the kids he had once regarded with suspicion preparing to march, he wondered if he was truly ready for this role. As the protesters began to organize, Frank stepped out of his car and walked toward Marcus, who stood at the periphery of the group. "Everything looks peaceful so far," Frank said, his voice steady despite his nerves. Marcus nodded, his expression unreadable. "It will stay that way, as long as people respect these kids' right to be heard." Frank understood the unspoken challenge in Marcus's words. This was his chance to prove he could be an ally, not just a bystander. Isaiah took a deep breath and raised the megaphone to his lips. "All right, everyone, let's make some noise for justice." The crowd erupted in cheers as they began to march down Main Street. Isaiah led the way, holding a banner that read "Equality Now," alongside Tyler and a few other youth center leaders. Chants of "No justice, no peace" filled the air, their voices echoing off the storefronts. Frank walked alongside the group, his posture relaxed but vigilant. His eyes scanned the crowd for signs of trouble, but what he saw instead was a powerful sense of unity. Parents marched with their children. Local business owners handed out water bottles to keep the protesters hydrated. And amidst it all, Isaiah's voice rang out strong and clear. About halfway through the march, a man in his 50s emerged from a diner, his face red with anger. "You're blocking traffic," he yelled, his voice cutting through the chants. "Go back where you came from." Isaiah froze mid-step, the insult hanging heavy in the air. Tyler grabbed his arm, whispering, "Just keep walking. Don't engage." But before Isaiah could respond, Frank stepped between him and the man. "Sir, these kids have every right to be here," Frank said firmly. his voice calm but unyielding. I suggest you let them exercise their First Amendment rights and go about your day. The man glared at Frank, but ultimately turned and walked away, muttering under his breath. Isaiah watched the exchange with a mix of surprise and cautious respect. "Thanks," he said to Frank, his tone clipped but genuine. Frank nodded. "Just doing my job." The march concluded in the town square, where a makeshift stage had been set up. Isaiah climbed onto the platform, the megaphone still in hand. He looked out over the sea of faces, young and old, black and white, united in their desire for change. "When I was 10 years old," Isaiah began, his voice steady, "I walked into a mall and was treated like a criminal because of the color of my skin. That experience could have broken me. But instead, it made me stronger. It made me realize that we have to fight for the world we want to live in." The crowd erupted in applause, but Isaiah raised his hand to quiet them. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he continued. "It starts with conversations, with standing up and saying, 'This isn't right.' It starts with all of us, right here, right now." As he stepped down from the stage, Isaiah was met with handshakes and pats on the back from community members, but it was Frank's brief nod of approval that stood out the most. Later that evening, as the protesters dispersed and the town square emptied, Isaiah found Frank standing alone by his patrol car. "You handled that guy back there pretty well," Isaiah said, his tone carefully neutral. Frank looked up, surprised by the compliment. "Thanks. You gave one hell of a speech." Isaiah shrugged. "I've had a good teacher." "Your dad?" Frank asked, though he suspected the answer. Isaiah hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, and maybe you too." Frank's breath caught in his chest. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a start. "That means a lot," he said quietly. The next day, local news stations replayed footage from the protest, highlighting Isaiah's speech and the peaceful atmosphere of the event. Interviews with participants painted a picture of a community coming together to address its flaws and build something better. At the youth center, kids buzzed with excitement, recounting their experiences to anyone who would listen. Frank found himself drawn into the conversations, his usual reserve giving way to genuine engagement. For Isaiah, the protest wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. And for Frank, it was another step toward becoming the man he wanted to be. That night, Frank sat at his desk, pen in hand, as he wrote in his journal, "Today I saw what change looks like. It's messy and uncomfortable, but it's also beautiful. And it starts with listening." The sky was painted with hues of pink and gold, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the youth center. Inside, the usually vibrant space was quieter than usual. The buzz of basketball games and art projects had faded, leaving only the soft hum of conversations and the occasional scrape of chairs against the floor. Tonight was different. Tonight was about listening, understanding, and breaking down walls. Frank Marshall sat in the corner of the youth center's art room, his hands resting on his knees. He had been asked by Marcus to attend a community circle, a gathering where people shared their experiences and struggles without judgment. The idea made Frank uneasy. Vulnerability wasn't something he was used to, let alone in front of a group of teenagers. Isaiah entered the room and immediately spotted Frank. Their eyes met briefly, and Isaiah gave a small nod before joining the circle. His presence added a weight of significance to the evening. Marcus stood at the center, his voice calm but firm. "Tonight, we're here to share, not to debate. This space is for truth. Speak it, hear it, and let it guide you." The circle began with a young girl named Mia, who spoke about her struggles balancing school and helping her family. Then came Tyler, whose family had faced eviction last year. Each story added another layer of understanding to the room. When it was Frank's turn, he hesitated. All eyes turned to him, including Isaiah's. "I grew up in a different world," Frank began, his voice low. "My father was a cop, and he believed in certain things I thought were the truth for a long time. He taught me to be tough, to never back down, to see the world in black and white. But what he didn't teach me was how to question those beliefs." He paused, his gaze falling to the floor. "For years, I didn't realize how those lessons shaped the way I saw people. I thought I was doing my job, but now I see how much harm I caused, how much harm I let happen, because I didn't know any better, or didn't want to." The room was silent. Frank looked up and met Isaiah's eyes. "I was wrong, and I'm trying to change. But it's not easy. Unlearning is harder than learning, and some days I wonder if I'll ever get it right." Isaiah sat still, his face unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady but carried a hint of emotion. "Change isn't about being perfect. It's about trying. And I see you trying, Officer Marshall. But trying isn't enough if it doesn't come with accountability." Frank nodded, accepting the truth of Isaiah's words. "You're right. I need to do more." Isaiah leaned forward, his tone softening. "We all have things we need to unlearn. My dad says it's about finding the courage to face yourself, even when it's uncomfortable." The room seemed to breathe collectively, the tension easing into something more open and understanding. The next day, Isaiah approached Frank with a proposal. "We're working on a mural for the youth center," he said, holding a sketch pad filled with rough designs. "It's supposed to represent the community, who we are and who we want to be. We could use your help." Frank hesitated, unsure if he was the right person for such a project. "I'm not much of an artist," he admitted. "You don't have to be," Isaiah replied. "Just show up. That's what matters." Over the next few weeks, Frank found himself at the youth center almost every evening, painting alongside the kids. The mural began to take shape, a vibrant depiction of unity, resilience, and hope. Frank worked on a section depicting the town square, carefully blending colors to create a sense of warmth and connection. One evening, as they painted side by side, Isaiah broke the silence. "Why do you keep coming back?" Frank set down his brush, considering the question. "Because I want to be better, and because I owe it to you, to this community, to prove I can change." Isaiah studied him for a moment before nodding. "You're getting there." As the mural neared completion, the youth center hosted an open house for the community to see the progress. Parents, local business owners, and even city officials gathered to admire the work. Frank stood to the side, watching as people marveled at the mural. He overheard snippets of conversation, words like powerful and inspiring, and felt a swell of pride. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. Marcus approached, his gaze sweeping over the mural before landing on Frank. "You've come a long way," he said, "but the real work is just beginning." Frank nodded, understanding the weight of the words. "I'm ready." Later that evening, Isaiah found Frank cleaning paintbrushes in the art room. "The mural looks amazing," Isaiah said, leaning against the doorframe. "It's all because of you and the kids," Frank replied. Isaiah smirked. "You helped too, you know." They worked in silence for a while, the unspoken bond between them growing stronger. Finally, Isaiah broke the quiet. "You're not who I thought you were. Not anymore." Frank looked up, surprised by the admission. "Thanks, Isaiah. That means more than you know." That night, as Frank drove home, he thought about the mural, the community circle, and the small moments that had begun to change his life. He knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. In his journal, he wrote, "Change isn't just about actions, it's about connection." And tonight, I felt connected to something real. The community center buzzed with a mix of tension and anticipation. The large meeting room was filled to capacity, with rows of folding chairs neatly arranged in front of a makeshift stage. Parents, teenagers, business owners, and local activists filled the space, their voices a low hum of conversation. The air was thick with expectation as the clock ticked closer to the start of the forum. Frank stood backstage, staring at the speech he had written on crumpled sheets of paper. His hands trembled slightly as he rehearsed the opening lines under his breath. Public speaking wasn't something he ever enjoyed, and the weight of tonight's event made it all the more daunting. This wasn't just about him. It was about facing the community he had wronged. Isaiah and Marcus entered the room, their presence grounding him. Isaiah, holding a clipboard filled with notes, offered a curt nod. "You ready?" Frank let out a shaky laugh. "As ready as I'll ever be." Marcus placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. "Speak from the heart. People can sense authenticity. That's all they want, your truth." Isaiah studied Frank, his expression unreadable. "Just don't make this about excuses. Talk about what you've learned and what you're doing to change. People need to see that it's more than words." Frank nodded, his stomach churning. "Thanks, Isaiah. I'll try." As the clock struck 7, Marcus stepped onto the stage, commanding the attention of the room with his authoritative presence. The audience quieted, their murmurs fading into an expectant silence. "Good evening, everyone," Marcus began, his voice steady and confident. "Thank you for joining us tonight. This forum is a chance for us to come together, to confront difficult truths, and to discuss how we move forward as a community." He paused, scanning the crowd. "Tonight, we'll hear from voices across our community. But first, I'd like to invite someone who has been on a personal journey of growth, someone who has had to face his own biases and take steps toward change. Please welcome Officer Frank Marshall." Frank's heart pounded as he stepped onto the stage. The bright overhead lights blinded him momentarily, and the sea of faces blurred into a single overwhelming presence. He gripped the edges of the podium. His prepared speech crumpled in his hands. Frank took a deep breath, forcing himself to meet the eyes of the audience. "6 months ago, I thought I understood what it meant to be a good police officer," he began, his voice slightly shaky. "I believed that following the rules and enforcing the law was enough. But I was wrong." He glanced at Isaiah, who sat in the front row, his expression stoic but attentive. "I was blind to my own biases. I made assumptions about people based on the way they looked, and those assumptions led me to hurt others, people like Isaiah Carter." The room was silent, every word hanging heavy in the air. Frank continued, his voice gaining strength. "The day I stopped Isaiah at the mall, I thought I was doing my job. But what I was really doing was upholding a system that treats people unfairly, a system I had never questioned." He paused, looking down at his crumpled speech before setting it aside. "These past months have been the hardest of my life. I've had to confront the man I was and decide if I wanted to change. I've learned that change isn't just about recognizing your mistakes. It's about doing the work to make things right." Frank's voice cracked slightly as he continued. "I want to thank Isaiah for his courage, for standing up for himself when I failed to see his worth. And I want to thank this community for giving me the chance to learn and grow. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here to show you that I'm committed to being better, not just as an officer, but as a person." As Frank stepped down from the podium, a ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Marcus returned to the stage, inviting the audience to ask questions. A middle-aged man raised his hand first. "Officer Marshall, what are you doing to ensure this doesn't happen again?" Frank stood, his posture more confident now. "I've started working closely with the youth center, listening to the kids and learning from their experiences. I'm also advocating for changes within the police department, training programs that focus on implicit bias and community engagement." Another hand shot up. A woman in her 30s. "How can we trust that this isn't just a performance?" Frank met her gaze directly. "You don't have to trust me yet. Trust is earned, and I know I have a lot of work to do. All I can promise is that I'll keep showing up and proving it through my actions." The questions continued, some pointed and skeptical, others more supportive. Through it all, Frank answered honestly, his humility and sincerity gradually softening the tension in the room. Toward the end of the session, Isaiah unexpectedly rose from his seat and walked to the stage. The audience murmured in surprise as Marcus handed him the microphone. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight," Isaiah began, his voice steady. "But I need to say something." He turned to Frank. "6 months ago, you saw me as a threat. Today, I see you trying to be better. That doesn't erase what happened, but it shows me that people can change if they're willing to." Isaiah faced the audience, his words carrying the wisdom of someone far beyond his years. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about a system that needs to change. We all have a role to play, whether it's standing up for what's right, like my dad taught me, or owning up to our mistakes, like Officer Marshall is doing now." The room erupted in applause, a standing ovation that filled the space with energy and hope. Frank felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched Isaiah command the stage with poise and conviction. After the forum ended, the crowd lingered, engaging in spirited discussions about the future. Frank found himself surrounded by people, some offering encouragement, others still voicing doubts. He welcomed every conversation, seeing each one as an opportunity to rebuild trust. Isaiah approached Frank, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You did good up there." "Thanks," Frank replied, his voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot coming from you." As they stood together, Marcus joined them, his expression one of quiet pride. "This is just the beginning," he said. "But tonight was a step in the right direction." Frank nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in a long time, he believed in the possibility of redemption, not just for himself, but for the entire community. That night, as Frank sat at his desk, he opened a blank notebook and began to write. "Tonight, I learned that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about building a future. One choice, one action, one conversation at a time." The morning sun bathed the youth center in a golden glow, illuminating the freshly painted walls and colorful murals created by the kids. The center was buzzing with excitement, anticipation hanging in the air like a tangible force. Today was a day of celebration, a culmination of months of effort, transformation, and community healing. Isaiah Carter stood in the youth center's main hall, glancing at the invitation in his hands. It was embossed with elegant lettering, Regional Youth Leadership Program Ceremony. His acceptance into the program had been the talk of the community, a beacon of hope for everyone who had supported and believed in him. But to Isaiah, it was more than an achievement. It was a responsibility. Frank Marshall arrived early at the center, as he had grown accustomed to doing over the past few months. He wore a crisp button-down shirt, a small but genuine smile on his face as he greeted the kids and staff. The once imposing officer now moved through the center with ease, his presence met with waves and nods rather than the tense silence that had greeted him months ago. "Morning, Officer Marshall," Isaiah called out from across the room, his voice lighter than Frank had ever heard it. "Good morning, Isaiah," Frank replied, walking over. "Big day today? Are you ready?" Isaiah shrugged, though his eyes betrayed his excitement. "I guess so. Just trying not to mess up my speech." Frank chuckled. "You'll do great. You always do." Isaiah hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Thanks for everything. I know it hasn't been easy, but I can see you've been trying." The simple acknowledgement hit Frank harder than he expected. He nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "That means a lot, Isaiah. Thank you." The youth center's gymnasium had been transformed into a proper event space, complete with a stage, rows of chairs, and decorations crafted by the kids. Families, community members, and local leaders filled the room, their conversations a hum of excitement. Marcus Carter took his place at the podium, his authoritative voice cutting through the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today to celebrate not just an individual achievement, but a community's growth and resilience." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Today we honor my son, Isaiah Carter, for his acceptance into the Regional Youth Leadership Program, a testament to his determination, courage, and unwavering commitment to justice." The applause was thunderous as Isaiah took the stage, his small frame standing tall and confident. He adjusted the microphone and scanned the room, his eyes lingering on Frank for a moment, before beginning. "When I started this journey, I didn't think it would lead me here," Isaiah began. "I was just a kid who wanted to go to the mall. But that day changed everything, not just for me, but for all of us." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "I learned that standing up for what's right isn't always easy. It's uncomfortable, it's scary, but it's necessary. And I also learned that people can change if they're willing to." Isaiah's voice grew stronger. "Officer Marshall is proof of that. He started as someone I couldn't trust, someone who saw me as a threat. But over the past few months, he's shown me that change is possible. When you listen, when you learn, and when you act." Frank felt a lump rise in his throat as Isaiah continued. "This isn't just my achievement. It's ours. Every kid in this room, every parent, every mentor who believed in me, who believes in this community. This is for all of us." The crowd erupted into applause as Isaiah finished, stepping away from the podium with a proud but humble smile. Marcus embraced him, whispering something that made Isaiah nod, his face glowing with pride. As the ceremony transitioned into a reception, Frank found himself approached by Marcus, who handed him a cup of punch with a knowing smile. "You've come a long way, Frank." Frank took the cup, his expression thoughtful. "I've still got a long way to go, but thank you." Marcus nodded. "The department is noticing. Your work here has set an example. There's talk of creating a permanent community outreach position, and I think you'd be perfect for it." Frank blinked, caught off guard. "You think I'm ready for something like that?" "You've already been doing it," Marcus said. "Now, it's just about making it official." Frank's mind raced. The idea of taking on such a role was daunting, but it felt right. For the first time in years, he felt like he was truly making a difference. Later that evening, as the festivities wound down, Frank found himself outside the youth center, leaning against the wall and watching the stars. The cool night air was a welcome contrast to the warmth of the celebration inside. Isaiah joined him, holding 2 cups of punch. He handed one to Frank without a word, sitting down on the steps beside him. "You gave a great speech today," Frank said after a moment. "Thanks," Isaiah replied. "You think they believed me? About people changing?" Frank smiled faintly. "I think you've shown them it's possible." Isaiah studied him, his expression thoughtful. "You've changed, you know. Not just the way you act, but the way you see things." Frank nodded slowly. "And I have you to thank for that. You didn't just call me out. You showed me a better way." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the distant sound of laughter and music drifting through the open door. The next morning, Frank stood in his small kitchen, staring at a blank sheet of paper. He picked up a pen and began to write. Change isn't a destination. It's a journey, one step at a time. It's about showing up, doing the work, and never forgetting why you started. He folded the paper and placed it in his pocket, a reminder of the lessons he'd learned and the work that still lay ahead. Later that day, he arrived at the youth center to find Isaiah organizing a group of kids for a new art project. They greeted him with smiles and waves, their acceptance a constant source of inspiration. "You're late," Isaiah teased, his grin wide. "Couldn't let you have all the fun," Frank replied, rolling up his sleeves and joining the group. As they worked together, the sound of laughter and collaboration filled the space, a testament to how far they'd come and the promise of what was yet to come. The story of Frank, Isaiah, and Marcus wasn't just about redemption. It was about the power of community, the courage to change, and the hope that comes from believing in each other. Together, they had built something stronger than they could have imagined: trust, understanding, and a shared vision for a better future. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey of redemption, courage, and hope. Isaiah, Frank, and Marcus showed us that change is possible when we choose to see the humanity in each other and work together to build a better future. Now, we want to hear from you. What moments in this story moved you the most? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment of unexpected transformation? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If you felt inspired by this story, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. There's so much more ahead. Stories that will move you, challenge you, and remind you of the power of connection. Join us for the next chapter, where we'll dive into another unforgettable journey. Let's grow, learn, and inspire each other together. See you soon.